Sex and attention are not random impulses. They are currencies. Every intimate interaction is shaped by invisible exchanges that decide who feels valued, who feels used, and who feels frustrated. When desire flows without reciprocity, resentment replaces attraction. This speech exposes the hidden economy behind sex, attention, and validation, and why misunderstanding this exchange silently destroys modern relationships. Sexual relationships are rarely driven by pure emotion, instinct, or chemistry alone. Beneath attraction, beneath romance, and beneath desire lies an unspoken system of exchange that quietly governs how men and women relate to one another. This exchange is not contractual, not verbalized, and not consciously negotiated, yet it exists in almost every intimate interaction. What makes it powerful is precisely the fact that most people deny or misunderstand it. The exchange is unequal in form but comparable in value. Men and women do not bring the same assets to the table, and they never have. Each sex offers something fundamentally different, shaped by biology, psychology, and evolutionary pressure. The mistake many people make is assuming equality must mean sameness. In reality, equality in relationships has always meant balance, not identical contribution. Men and women evaluate value differently because they prioritize different outcomes. What one sex naturally possesses in abundance, the other must earn, cultivate, or compete for. This creates a dynamic where attraction is not just emotional, but transactional in a deeper sense. Not transactional in a cold or malicious way, but in a natural behavioral sense where effort, reward, and reinforcement shape future behavior. This exchange becomes invisible because modern culture avoids acknowledging asymmetry. People are taught that desire should be unconditional, that affection should be freely given, and that expectation is inherently manipulative. Yet biology does not operate on ideals, it operates on incentives. When incentives disappear, motivation follows. When value is given without cost, it rapidly loses perceived worth. The imbalance emerges when one side believes their contribution should be automatically reciprocated, while the other sees no obligation to respond. This is where frustration is born. Not because either side is wrong, but because the exchange has become distorted. One party feels they are giving something of significance, while the other treats it as incidental or disposable. Understanding this keynote reframes conflict. It explains why attraction fades without effort, why resentment grows without acknowledgement, and why people feel used even in relationships that appear consensual on the surface. The moment one side feels the exchange is no longer balanced, emotional withdrawal begins, even if physical intimacy continues. This unspoken economy does not disappear when ignored. It becomes more powerful, and those who fail to recognize it inevitably participate in it blindly, reacting emotionally to outcomes they never understood were being negotiated in the first place. Sex and attention are not random impulses. They are currencies. Every intimate interaction is shaped by invisible exchanges that decide who feels valued, who feels used, and who feels frustrated. When desire flows without reciprocity, resentment replaces attraction. This speech exposes the hidden economy behind sex, attention, and validation, and why misunderstanding this exchange silently destroys modern relationships. When the word resources is mentioned in the context of relationships, it is almost immediately reduced to money. This oversimplification distorts the entire dynamic and fuels resentment on both sides. Resources are not a bank balance or a paycheck. They are anything that increases security, opportunity, or emotional stability over time. When misunderstood, this concept turns natural exchange into moral accusation. Men do not primarily trade cash for intimacy. They trade capability. Capability to provide structure, direction, protection, and problem-solving. These resources are often invisible because they are not flashy. Leadership, decisiveness, emotional containment, time investment, and mental availability all fall under the category of resources, yet they rarely receive recognition as such. A man's time itself is a resource. Attention directed consistently toward one person carries opportunity cost. When a man chooses to invest his time, focus, and energy into a relationship, he is forfeiting alternatives. This is why time withdrawal is perceived so strongly. It signals a reallocation of resources away from that exchange. Stability is another overlooked resource. Predictability, reliability, and emotional regulation create an environment where intimacy can grow without chaos. Many men provide this without realizing its value, and many women receive it without consciously acknowledging the cost it takes to maintain. When stability is present, it is invisible. When it disappears, its value becomes undeniable. Protection is not merely physical. It includes shielding a partner from unnecessary stress, absorbing emotional turbulence without escalation, and acting as a buffer between external threats and internal peace. This form of resource expenditure requires strength, self-control, and restraint, all of which are limited assets. The problem arises when these resources are given without boundaries or awareness. When a man overinvests resources without reciprocal reinforcement, those resources lose perceived value. Generosity without structure trains entitlement, not appreciation. The exchange begins to collapse, not because resources were insufficient, but because they were delivered without signaling cost. Recognizing the full spectrum of resources reframes male contribution. It clarifies why withdrawal happens, why burnout occurs, and why men disengage emotionally when their investment is taken for granted. Resources are not demanded. They are offered conditionally, even when unspoken. Once that condition feels violated, the exchange no longer feels balanced, and the system begins to break down quietly, long before anyone admits something is wrong, which carries asymmetric leverage. Sexual access is not merely a physical act. It is a gatekeeping mechanism that shapes power, pacing, and emotional investment within relationships. Its influence does not come from moral judgment or cultural conditioning alone, but from asymmetry. What is abundant to one side is scarce to the other, and scarcity always carries leverage. This leverage is often misunderstood, denied, or framed as manipulation, when in reality, it is a structural feature of human mating dynamics. Women, by default, control access to sexual intimacy. This control is not absolute, but it is statistically consistent enough to shape behavior. Sexual access functions as a high-impact offering because it triggers motivation, attachment, and effort. The value does not lie in the act itself, but in what the act signals: selection, acceptance, and temporary exclusivity. These signals activate reinforcement mechanisms that influence future investment. The leverage is asymmetric because the cost is asymmetric. Sexual access carries different biological, emotional, and social consequences. Risk, vulnerability, and potential attachment are not distributed evenly. Because the potential cost is higher, the act carries greater bargaining power, even when it is freely given. This is why its premature or unreciprocated exchange often leads to dissatisfaction rather than closeness. Problems arise when sexual access is detached from reinforcement. When intimacy is offered without corresponding attention, validation, or emotional presence, it loses its strategic weight. The leverage dissolves, not because the act loses value, but because it is no longer paired with conditions. Once access becomes unconditional, it no longer functions as a signal of selection. It becomes background noise. This creates confusion. Women may feel emotionally shortchanged without understanding why. Men may feel satisfied physically while remaining emotionally distant. Neither side is consciously exploiting the other, yet the imbalance persists because the exchange has lost structure. Desire continues, but meaning erodes. Sexual access is most reinforcing when it is paced, contextualized, and reciprocated. Its power lies not in frequency, but in timing and response. When paired with attention and commitment, it strengthens bonds. When separated from them, it amplifies feelings of being undervalued. Ignoring this dynamic does not eliminate it. It simply removes the language needed to understand frustration. Sexual access will always influence power dynamics, whether acknowledged or not. Those who fail to recognize its leverage often surrender it unintentionally, then wonder why the exchange no longer feels fair, fulfilling, or emotionally safe. Attention is not passive presence. It is an active investment. Where attention goes, value is assigned. In intimate relationships, attention operates as a powerful reinforcer, shaping behavior, attachment, and emotional security. While sex is often treated as the ultimate currency of intimacy, attention frequently holds equal or greater weight because it determines whether desire feels meaningful or disposable. Attention communicates prioritization. Consistent focus signals that someone matters beyond momentary gratification. It validates effort, reinforces emotional safety, and sustains attraction over time. Without attention, intimacy feels hollow, even when physical closeness exists. This is why attention deprivation can feel more painful than sexual rejection. It erodes perceived worth rather than desire alone. From a reinforcement perspective, attention rewards investment. When emotional or sexual effort is met with sustained engagement, it encourages repetition. When it is met with indifference, motivation collapses. Attention, therefore, does not merely accompany intimacy. It determines its perceived value. A relationship can survive periods of reduced sex, but it rarely survives sustained absence of attention. The asymmetry appears when attention is withheld after access is granted. Physical intimacy without follow-up attention creates a psychological gap. One side experiences fulfillment, while the other experiences abandonment. This imbalance is not rooted in entitlement, but in expectations shaped by reinforcement history. When intimacy previously resulted in closeness and focus, its sudden absence signals withdrawal rather than neutrality. Attention also stabilizes attachment. It regulates uncertainty, reducing anxiety and emotional volatility. When attention is inconsistent, the nervous system stays in a heightened state, seeking reassurance. This creates cycles of overgiving, overthinking, and emotional exhaustion. The issue is not neediness, but disrupted reinforcement. Importantly, attention is finite. Giving it consistently requires effort, presence, and emotional bandwidth. When attention is freely taken without acknowledgement, it becomes depleted. Over time, withdrawal becomes inevitable. The absence of attention is often misinterpreted as loss of interest, when it is more accurately a response to perceived imbalance. Understanding attention as a reinforcing reward clarifies many relational conflicts. It explains why sex alone does not sustain bonds, why validation matters beyond attraction, and why people feel invisible despite physical closeness. Attention is not a bonus. It is a core component of exchange. When it is missing, the system destabilizes, leaving intimacy feeling transactional rather than connective, and desire slowly detaches from emotional investment. Conflict in intimate relationships rarely begins with betrayal or hostility. It begins with imbalance. Specifically, with the experience of giving something meaningful and receiving nothing reinforcing in return. When sex is received without corresponding attention or validation, the emotional contract is silently broken, even if no explicit promises were ever made. Sex, when paired with attention, communicates mutual selection. It signals that intimacy has emotional weight and future orientation. When attention disappears afterward, the meaning of the act is retroactively altered. What once felt like connection begins to feel like extraction. The conflict is not about the act itself, but about the absence of acknowledgement that follows. Validation functions as confirmation of value. It reassures that intimacy mattered, that effort was seen, and that vulnerability was not misplaced. Without validation, uncertainty fills the gap. The mind searches for explanation, often concluding devaluation. This internal narrative forms long before confrontation ever occurs. The asymmetry becomes more pronounced because the benefits are unevenly distributed. One side experiences physical satisfaction and closure, while the other is left in emotional suspension. This suspension creates anxiety, frustration, and resentment. Not because of unmet demands, but because reinforcement patterns have been disrupted. The system no longer rewards participation. Over time, repeated experiences of unreciprocated intimacy condition emotional withdrawal. Trust erodes not through deception, but through neglect. Each instance reinforces the belief that giving more will not produce closeness, only depletion. This belief hardens into emotional distance, even when desire remains. Attempts to address the imbalance often fail because the conflict is misframed. It is labeled as insecurity, neediness, or overreaction. This dismissal intensifies the issue. When validation is requested and denied, it confirms the very fear driving the request. The cycle deepens, not because communication failed, but because acknowledgement was withheld. Eventually, conflict surfaces in indirect forms: irritability, disengagement, reduced intimacy, or emotional shutdown. By the time it is recognized, the reinforcement system has already collapsed. Repair becomes difficult because the cost of reinvestment feels too high. Understanding this keynote reframes conflict as a signal, not a flaw. It reveals that emotional frustration is not a demand for more, but a response to less. When sex is divorced from attention and validation, it loses its bonding function. What remains is contact without connection, and connection cannot survive where reinforcement is absent. When an exchange feels balanced, neither side questions it. When imbalance is perceived, meaning begins to fracture. This imbalance does not need to be extreme or intentional. It only needs to be repeated. Over time, these repetitions shape identity, expectation, and emotional posture. Women often internalize imbalance as devaluation, while men may unconsciously interpret the same pattern as entitlement. Neither response is malicious, but both are conditioned. For women, repeated experiences of giving intimacy without receiving sustained attention or validation gradually alter self-perception. The absence of reinforcement sends a subtle message: what was offered did not warrant investment in return. This interpretation does not arise from insecurity alone, but from pattern recognition. When effort consistently goes unrewarded, the mind assigns reduced value to that effort, and eventually, to the self. Emotional withdrawal follows not as punishment, but as self-protection. This devaluation is amplified because intimacy involves vulnerability. When vulnerability is met with indifference, it retroactively reframes the act as a mistake. The emotional system adapts by either withholding future intimacy or demanding reassurance. Both responses are attempts to restore balance, not to control outcomes. On the other side, entitlement develops through reinforcement without cost. When intimacy is received consistently without the requirement of attention, validation, or commitment, the behavior becomes normalized. The absence of consequence teaches that nothing further is required. Over time, effort feels optional rather than necessary. Entitlement is not a conscious belief of superiority. It is a learned expectation shaped by repeated reward without investment. This dynamic creates mutual misunderstanding. Women experience emotional neglect and feel unseen. Men experience dissatisfaction only when access is threatened, not when attention is withdrawn. Each interprets the other's response as irrational, when in reality both are reacting logically to their reinforcement history. The system destabilizes because entitlement and devaluation feed each other. The more one side withdraws emotionally, the more the other resists investing. Repair becomes difficult because restoring balance now feels like a loss rather than a gain. What once required effort now feels like concession. Recognizing this pattern removes moral judgment and replaces it with clarity. These outcomes are not character flaws. They are conditioned responses. When reinforcement is restored, when attention, validation, and effort are reintroduced, the dynamic can rebalance. Without that restoration, the relationship slowly shifts from connection to transaction until neither side feels valued, only reactive. The intricate dynamics of sexual relationships are governed by an unspoken economy, a system of exchange where sex, attention, resources, and validation operate as currencies. Understanding this system is not about reducing intimacy to cold transactions, but about recognizing the reinforcement patterns that drive human behavior. When the exchange is balanced, relationships thrive. When it is disrupted, frustration, resentment, and withdrawal emerge. The insights from this video illuminate why so many modern relationships struggle despite desire, attraction, or emotional investment. At the core of this economy is asymmetry. Men and women bring fundamentally different forms of value to relationships. Men generally provide resources, broadly defined as protection, stability, time, emotional presence, and capability. Bus, the evolution of desire. Meston and Bus, why women have sex. Women primarily offer sexual access, which carries inherent leverage due to its biological and emotional cost. Recognizing that these contributions are unequal but comparable in value reframes conflict. Imbalance is rarely a matter of moral failing, but of mismanaged reinforcement and unmet expectations. Attention functions as one of the most critical reinforcing rewards in this system. Research in behavioral psychology and social exchange theory, B.F. Skinner, Behavior of Organisms, Homans, Social Exchange Theory, demonstrates that reinforcement determines future behavior. In intimate relationships, attention signals value, confirms effort, and strengthens emotional bonds. Sex without corresponding attention or validation undermines reinforcement, leaving one side feeling devalued, while the other may unknowingly develop entitlement. This cycle creates repeated misunderstandings, emotional withdrawal, and conflict. Perceived imbalance drives the emotional consequences that are often misinterpreted as insecurity, neediness, or moral shortcomings. Women experience frustration and feelings of being undervalued when their intimacy is received without attention or validation. Levine and Heller, Attached. Men may interpret the same imbalance as entitlement when they receive sexual access without perceiving the costs or needs involved. Both responses are logical outcomes of the reinforcement history, highlighting the importance of understanding relational dynamics without moral judgment. The video emphasizes that modern relationships falter not because of lack of desire or attraction, but because the implicit exchange of value is ignored or mismanaged. Recognizing this hidden economy allows partners to intentionally structure reinforcement through attention, validation, emotional presence, and equitable effort to sustain attraction, deepen connection, and prevent resentment. Timing, pacing, and reciprocity of both physical and emotional contributions are crucial to maintaining balance. Ultimately, this framework is not prescriptive, but explanatory. It bridges evolutionary psychology, behavioral science, and social exchange theory, providing a lens to understand why certain conflicts arise and how they can be addressed. By acknowledging the currency of sex, attention, and validation, individuals gain clarity over relational patterns, learn to identify imbalances before they escalate, and cultivate partnerships where desire and emotional fulfillment coexist. When this hidden economy is respected, relationships operate as mutually reinforcing systems rather than reactive cycles of unmet expectations. Recognizing this pattern removes moral judgment and replaces it with clarity. These outcomes are not character flaws. They are conditioned responses. When reinforcement is restored, when attention, validation, and effort are reintroduced, the dynamic can rebalance. Without that restoration, the relationship slowly shifts from connection to transaction until neither side feels valued, only reactive.